Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Proactive Parenting, Preventative Measures to Protect Children from Substance Use, an event with Dr. Linda Richter and Dr. Weiner, produced by the Wellness Institute in collaboration with Partnership to End Addiction. My name is Menachem Klein, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Wellness Institute and the following schools and organizations who have partnered with us in bringing this training to you this evening: Ohev Shalom, RASG Hebrew Academy of Miami, Coalition for Jewish Learning, Hebrew Academy of Montreal, Santa Monica Malibu Unified School District, Temple Emmanuel San Francisco, Columbus Torah Academy, Jewish House, Jewish Community High School of the Bay, Netivot HaTorah Day School, Bialik Hebrew Day School, Toronto Heschel Schools, Associated Hebrew Schools, Regesh Services, UJA of Greater Toronto, Robbins Hebrew Academy, Ma'on Noam Congregation, Leo Beck Day School, Jax Toronto, Vancouver Talmud Torah, Vancouver Hebrew Academy, Richmond Jewish Day School, King David High School, Mama Tefet Community Society, No Fear Counseling, Moving Forward Family Services, The Bayet, NCSY of Vancouver, WRSS JCC, and Project L'Chaim of Vancouver. Firstly, a big thank you to all of you who are joining us tonight. As parents, I know it's isn't easy to find time in our busy day, but we're pleased that you could join us to learn about this important topic directly from two of the nation's leading experts. Before we start, it would be great if you can note in the chat where you're located and how you heard about this event. We have participants from across the community in the US and Canada, and we'd love to know where you're joining us from. I'd like to take a minute to express our sincere gratitude to our visionary donors, some of who are joining us tonight. Without their support, this training and all Wellness Institute projects would not be possible. I do want to note that after the presentation, we'll be taking questions. If you have any questions on any part of the presentation, please feel free to ask in the chat. Substance use is on the rise. Research shows that 90% of youth substance use begins during their teenage years. As we will hear tonight, however, this is preventable. Jewish law teaches that we are required to protect ourselves and those around us from danger. In line with the commandment to build a fence upon our roof so that no one falls, we are enjoined to proactively seek out measures we can take to prevent a calamity from occurring. Many parents are concerned for their children's well-being, and much attention has been given to postvention, rehabilitation, and suing vaping companies. Tonight, we will learn how to broaden that conversation. Here at the Wellness Institute, we believe that the best medicine is providing our youth with the skills they need to face life's challenges and grow through them. A child's risk of turning to substances for relief is lowered exponentially when they have the tools for stress reduction, mindfulness, and in their mental well-being toolkit. Joining us tonight, we have two experts who will teach us about preventative measures parents can take, Dr. Linda Richter and Dr. Weiner. Dr. Linda Richter is Vice President of Research at Partnership to End Addiction. She researches the nature, scope, predictors, and consequences of substance use and addiction, especially among young people. She leverages this research to help raise awareness among parents, educators, health professionals, and policymakers about addiction science and best practices in substance use prevention and addiction care. Dr. Richter will introduce key parenting strategies helpful for boosting protection and reducing risk in the context of addictive substances young people are currently most likely to encounter and use. Dr. Richter?
Thank you. Let me just get this going. Great. Thank you for the introduction. Right, so can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So what I'd like to do is I am going to give some overview about what kind of substances we need to be worried about and all that. But before I get to that, I know this slide kind of seems a little bit half jokey and half serious, but the reason I show it is because we hear a lot of scary things as parents, and there are a lot of things to be worried about in our current society. If you read the newspaper, if you talk to other parents, if you attend webinars like these regularly, you are bombarded with things to be worried about as a parent. And many of these are quite reasonable to be worried about. There is a lot to be concerned about with our kids growing up today. Some of them are things that are being kind of placed on our families to worry about. Some of the things that as adults we have to be concerned about, whether it's financial stress or dealing with our aging parents as we're trying to raise children, political polarization, being kind of the subject of prejudice or discrimination or being around it, And then there's all these, things in purple that kind of afflict our children that we worry about. So in that context, I like to sort of, before I get to what you should be worried about when it comes to substance use for your children, and before Dr. Weiner takes over and talks a little bit more about that in greater depth and also some mental health issues, I do want to kind of normalize or calm people down a little bit about some common misconceptions that a lot of parents have about parenting and their children, and to kind of try and put things in perspective a little bit for us and think about our parenting in a way that doesn't pathologize our children too much. So I know these slides I'm going to show you, some of them are kind of content heavy, and you're going to get all these later. So if you miss something, then you can sort of take a look at them later on. But there are a few key points that I like to point out before I get into the substance use topic. A lot of parents sort of feel that their kids are like a strange species, like there's something irrational or erratic, unpredictable, a little scary about them, especially as they enter their preteen and teenage years. And in fact, I was at a presentation recently where the parenting expert speaker basically said that, she said, think of your teenager as someone with a psychotic disorder. That's how crazy and unpredictable teenagers are. And it kind of made me cringe, because I certainly don't agree with that perspective. I think it's really helpful to take a look at your kids and perceive their feelings and behaviors in a way that you understand that what they're doing and feeling usually makes good sense. And even if their reactions to things are not exactly the same as they would be for an adult, the way children behave and feel and react is often part of an essential developmental process that is quite normal and healthy. So that'll become clear in a couple of minutes, but here's another, like, my child behaves well outside the home, but is so emotional and acts out once they get home. I must be doing something wrong, or there must be something wrong with my child. It's really good to keep in mind that if you are actually offering your child a safe, secure environment, then you're more likely to see that. You're more likely to see your child come home and sort of let loose and unleash a little bit. And that's really often a sign, unless it's obviously out of proportion, that your child feels safe and secure with you, because all day long they're holding it together to perform properly and appropriately and interact with the people around them at school or outside in their community in an appropriate way. And just like adults need to come home and sort of just chill out and relax a little bit, kids need that too. And if they're doing that when they get home, instead of seeing it as a sign of trouble, you might consider it, unless again it's out of proportion, as a good sign that they feel secure and safe in the home. Another misconception is parents always have to get it right the first time. So if your kid comes to you with something and you sort of react in a certain way because you didn't have a chance to really think it through, and then you regret it afterwards, a lot of times, I know I've had this experience, you feel like, oh man, I didn't handle that well. I wish I would have done it differently. And I think just a little shift in the reasoning where you say, you know what, I didn't handle it that well. I can go over to my child in a little bit and acknowledge that I didn't handle it the way I would have wanted to if I had more time to think about it, and to kind of let them know that and give your reaction another try and deal with it differently. And that goes into this next one, where it's really okay for parents actually to say they're sorry and to show uncertainty, to show some discomfort. It doesn't risk compromising your child's regard or respect for you. It actually is a great modeling tool. And you're going to hear me talk a lot about modeling, where your child can learn from that if they make a mistake, if they do something they regret, really the best thing to do is to own it, acknowledge it, apologize for it, and try and do better, and to be flexible and open-minded. So the more we could show that to our children in our relationship with them, the more that they'll learn that that's a kind of normal, adaptive way to behave. And again, this is not to say you're not the authority and you let your kids run all over you, but if you sincerely feel like you didn't handle something well, it's perfectly fine and actually quite healthy to let your kids know that. Another really common thought that a lot of parents have is, my kids completely stop listening to me once they hit their preteen years. Like, it doesn't matter what I say, they're not paying any attention. The things in black here are things based in research. It's not my personal opinion. So we know from research, and a lot of it, that although children might stop showing that they're listening to you when you tell them something, they are actually listening. But to be honest, even more than listening, they're watching what you do. And there again is the modeling issue. If you tell them one thing but behave differently, they're paying more attention to your behaviors than to your words. But we do know from the research, and this is from decades of research, especially with regard to substance use, that teens consistently report that their parents have the most influence over their attitudes and behaviors. And that's even true when it comes to actual teenagers who are very influenced by their peers, no doubt, but their parents continue to be rated as, for the most part, the main primary source of influence over their substance-related attitudes and behaviors. So that's important to keep in mind. We also often think that we're like a broken record if we keep saying the same thing over and over again about health and safety messages. They're just not listening, they're not hearing it. And in fact, we know from the research that they may not hear it or listen the first time, but over time, incrementally, the message does seep through, and it is worth repeating over and over and over again in frequent conversations. And that is about explaining to them the issues related to substance use, issues related to mental health, behaviors you'd like them to show, any kind of important health and safety related messages is worth repeating to your child. So don't give up. A couple more that I think are just important as background here. A lot of parents feel, and I know this from work that I've done and also interacting with parents and kind of these kind of meetings, where they worry that if they say no to a child who's asking to do something they worry is a little risky or unsafe, that it's going to alienate the child, it's going to harm their relationship with the child. The kid might rebel or react, God forbid, even in a dangerous way, potentially self-harming or something. Now, clearly, there are certain situations where kids are quite troubled and you do have to be concerned about that. But for the most part, if you say no to an unhealthy or risky request that your child is asking from you, they will be upset and they might not talk to you for a little while, but it, for the most part, will not cause any kind of lasting harm. And more importantly, these kind of boundaries and limits are really what kids need and want. Of course, they won't admit to it, but they provide security and stability and predictability, which is super important for young people. There's also this conception that my teen doesn't want me around. They want me to just completely leave them alone. Again, the research doesn't show this. It shows a kernel of truth there, which is that teens really feel the most secure if their parents are around. If they're kind of home when they're home, but mostly because they want you there if they need you, if they want to talk to you, if they have something to say. They don't want you being overly intrusive. And it's kind of frustrating for a parent, but a great metaphor, which Dr. Lisa D'Amour, who's a psychologist, writes in the New York Times, and she just has like great metaphors. She talks about parents as being like a potted plant. You kind of just have that plant sitting in the house, and if the kid wants it, it's there. And that's not to say you shouldn't feel free to talk to your kids whenever you want, but this notion that they don't want you there at all is actually not accurate. The other great metaphor she has, which I love, is to consider yourself as like a wall in a swimming pool, especially when you're dealing with teenagers. So the idea is that, they sort of start out at the wall, then kind of move out, and they're swimming around in the pool, experiencing life, doing their thing. But when they get tired, when they get scared, when they're losing a little confidence in their ability to stay afloat, they kind of come back to the wall and they hang on there for a little bit until they get their energy back, until they get their confidence back. And then they go back into the water. And then the interesting part is they don't like softly just float away. They usually kick off the wall, leaving the parent, who is the wall in this metaphor, being like, what just happened to me? I thought we were having a moment and now my kids just kicked off and went without saying goodbye. But the truth is that, just to understand that for teenagers, the parent being there is like a safe spot, like security. And so we don't always get the expressions of appreciation that we're looking for, but that doesn't mean that your role there is not important and critical. Couple more, which are, a lot of parents believe that if they don't react immediately to a child's undesired behavior, like bad behavior, that behavior will necessarily repeat. And this is true for substance use, but other things as well. And it's not to say you want to let your kid just go misbehaving and never react to it. I'm not saying that at all. But sometimes if you give it a minute, kids often recognize on their own that what they did wasn't great, and that their lapses were not really the right thing to do. And they'll own it and they'll learn more from it than if you kind of jump on them immediately with the admonitions and consequences and punishments. And the research does show, and if you try it, you'll see that the reinforcing the positive behaviors and focusing more on the positive is going to have more long-term effects on producing the desired behaviors in your kids than always pointing out the negative things that they've done and doling out the punishments. These next two, I don't mean them in a controversial way. As Dr. Weiner is going to talk about, we are in a mental health crisis for children. There is, skyrocketing rates of all sorts of issues with young people for a whole variety of reasons. But one side point of that, or side consequence of that, is that we have pathologized kids, and we have given a lot of people the language to kind of frame everything as a mental health problem. And what that does, in my opinion, and is it kind of makes fairly normal and adaptive developmental behavior seem like a problem. So, there are no such things as bad emotions or bad feelings. Like, these are all normal feelings and emotions to have. What happens is, when you need to be concerned is to what extent is a child's reaction, emotional reaction or feeling out of proportion to the cause. So for example, if a kid is anxious or if a kid is sad, typically it's for a good reason. Like, anxiety is a very healthy protective signal to tell a child, the situation you're in is not good, get out of it, or what you're about to do, it may not be the right thing to do. So kind of change your ways, right? Or if something negative happens and a child feels sad, that's normal. Like, a kid does not have to be happy all the time. If you guys think back to being in, let's say, 7th grade and sitting in school all day and having people constantly telling you what to do, like, the existence is not all that fun every single minute. So feeling frustrated, sad, anxious, those are normal experiences. And again, are normal feelings. And again, what a parent really wants to look out for is, are those reactions prolonged at a proportion to what the stimulating event was? And does the child sort of not come out of it? Like, is it persisting? So that's really the issue, and not to pathologize every sort of negative emotion, or even if it's lasting for a couple of hours. And then finally, again, trauma. We hear a lot about trauma nowadays, and certainly there are significant traumas that occur to many children, unfortunately, and they do have severely lasting consequences, especially when it comes to substance use risk. So it's a concept that comes up a lot in this area. But what's important to kind of keep in mind is that trauma is not necessarily a function of the experience. It's really a function of the child's or young person's ability to tolerate or cope with that experience. And so the same bad experience can happen to two different kids, and one will be very bothered by it and feel terribly for a while, but it will not have lasting consequences, whereas another child, that experience might really have long-term consequences. So again, it's more about matching the child's reaction and ability to cope with something that happens to them, and whether that's within the normal bounds or if it is prolonged and causing concern. So just, if I could just have you keep these thoughts in mind as we talk about substance use specifically, that would be really helpful. And then as we move on later to how you could sort of think about these things and others in terms of protecting your kids from substance use risk and helping them be resilient and strong to the influences that are all around them. So when we talk about substance use, we tend to focus on adolescence or the teen years, preteen also. And the reason for that, as I'm sure you mostly know, is that this is the period of life where there is intense and transformative brain development. A lot is going on in your child's brain at this time. And what's really important to recognize is that risk-taking is a very normal and healthy part of this stage of life. It shouldn't be suppressed. It's kind of what needs to happen. And that's because these risks allow youth to encounter new experiences, learn from them, and be prepared for adulthood. If they're kept in a box, they're not going to be able to handle adulthood when it comes their way. The problem is that the risk-taking developing brain, which is adaptive and normal, is not fully equipped with the controls it needs to kind of rein in the really harmful behaviors. And that's where the parents have to come in, and where we also need other supports from the community and from society at large to protect kids who are not really fully prepared to handle all that comes at them, the risks that come at them, and that they're drawn to. So we do know that adolescence is the developmental stage that is most vulnerable to trying substances. And when I say substances, I mean nicotine, alcohol, and drugs. and to experiencing the consequences of it. And when kids use substances during the adolescent years while their brain is still undergoing these developmental changes, it could produce really significant structure and functional changes in the brain that can persist into adulthood and that do underlie addiction. So years of research have shown that adolescence is the critical period for laying the groundwork for developing addiction. And the age of use really matters. So for kids who start using before age 18, they have about 25% chance of developing addiction. Use after age 21, preferably later, the risk of addiction goes down significantly. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that soon. And that's because, the parts of the brain that are responsible for all the things that we talk about as executive functioning, decision-making, memory, attention, impulse control, those are still under development during the teen years. And when you introduce an addictive substance into the brain while that's going on, it really permanently, or at least for a little while, certainly can affect the development of those critical life functions. So how concerned do we have to be about addiction among kids? I mean, there's a lot of different data sources based on a national data set of people aged 12 and older. We know that among teenagers or youth ages 12 to 17, about close to 9% met the clinical diagnostic criteria for an alcohol or drug use disorder. So please note that this does not include nicotine, which is actually a very prevalent substance among that is used among kids this age. And a very small proportion of those kids end up getting the treatment they need, which is a separate topic, but something to keep in mind. But as we talk about all the scary statistics around substance use among teens, I think it's really important to recognize that most teens don't use substances at all, and that we're seeing a significant increase in the number of kids who report abstaining from nicotine, alcohol, or drugs over the course of their lifetime, which is really encouraging. And it also is important to normalize this because one significant influence on young people is this perception that everyone's doing these things. And if the fact is that not everyone is doing these things and more kids are choosing not to, that can have an effect on an individual child's decision about whether they want to use nicotine, alcohol, or drugs. So because these substances are prevalent in our society, really, there's nobody who's at no risk for using them. Every child is at some risk, but there are certain factors that increase risk for certain children. One of the primary ones is whether they're in a friend group where the other kids use. That just comes through time and again in all the research. So again, to the extent that parents can have an influence on that, great. Another critical one is obviously if the parents themselves use these substances and model it for their kids, or if their siblings do. We know that if a kid reports an intention to use in the future, that's something to watch out for because those kids are very likely to do so. Kids who don't feel connected to their school, to their community, who don't really have a sense of future, a sense of purpose, a sense of goals going forward, they're at higher risk. Certain kids are just more interested in trying things, sensation seeking. So, those kids tend to be at higher risk. We know that certainly children with mental health problems that are not well treated, who have high levels of stress or who have experienced significant trauma are at higher risk of substance use. I have a strong interest in policy and the sort of the landscape in which kids live and the effects on them. And as a society, we don't do enough to protect kids from all the wars out there to use nicotine, alcohol, and drugs. There's a tremendous amount of advertising and marketing that glamorizes use of these substances. They're fairly easy for kids to get. There's a general perception in our society that these using substances is a harmless rite of passage, that it's inevitable. There's not much people could do to stop it. And for the most part, people are not particularly concerned about a kid drinking once in a while, using marijuana once in a while, vaping once in a while. They don't really see the harm for the most part. And that message seeps through to kids who themselves don't think it's the biggest deal. So when we do talk about substance use, it's important to know which substances are kids most at risk of using. And when we're talking about adolescents, it's alcohol, it's nicotine vaping, and it's marijuana use, including marijuana vaping. And no surprise, these are the substances that are mostly legal or becoming legal. They're easily available. They have significant industries that make a lot of money to push their use. And they're generally perceived as not as risky as harder drugs, to some extent for good reason, but the extent to which they're used in our society makes them quite risky, actually. I'm going to just go quickly through some of these, just the basic things to know in case you're at the early stages of this and what you want to be aware of when it comes to kids and what they're attracted to, what these substances. So when it comes to alcohol, we know, as I said, that drinking in the United States is very much part of our culture. It's all over our advertising and marketing. It's part of popular culture, music and TV, movies and social media. And it's part of our social culture that it's, you expect alcohol at a get-together, a party, holidays, and celebrations. And what's more concerning now is that the alcohol industry has started selling alcohol products that look like soda or look like seltzer. They come in flavors, they're fairly inexpensive, and they are marketed in a way that really do appeal to kids who are looking for something sweet, kind of discreet to use, so adults may not realize that they're drinking alcohol if it looks like they're drinking a soda, fairly inexpensive, and very available. Like a lot of, if you think of White Claw or some of these other products, you could just sort of see them in supermarkets or in pharmacy, drugstores, just laid out there, and they're very easy to access and get. And they kind of normalize drinking and reduce kids' perceptions of their harm. What's important when you think about kids and alcohol is that whereas many kids don't drink at all, those who do tend to do so pretty intensely. And when we talk about binge drinking, which is drinking a lot in a given period of time, 90% of all the alcohol consumed by young people who drink occurs in the context of binge drinking. So binge drinking is the norm for kids who are drinking. And back to the earlier slide, we know that those who drink are about twice as likely as adults to meet the clinical criteria for an alcohol use disorder. So the effects of the alcohol use on a young person compared to an adult is quite significantly higher when it comes to concerns about addiction or an alcohol use disorder. And obviously this is not surprising, but as kids get older, their perceptions of how risky it is to drink tend to decline. And their perceptions of how easy it is to get the alcohol tend to go up. We know that alcohol is an issue for kids. It is toxic to the adolescent brain. It damages its development. And although people drink because they want to soothe symptoms of anxiety, depression, or stress, in the long term, it actually worsens rather than helps those symptoms. And we have to be concerned now, given the context of a lot of mental health issues among kids, that it reduces inhibitions and impulse control, and it can contribute to self-harm or suicidal behavior in kids. And we do know that alcohol is a main contributor to the leading causes of injury and death among young people. This is a slide I show whenever I get a chance. It's the age at which a kid first uses that you have to really be concerned about. The earlier a child uses, the higher their risk of developing addiction to alcohol. So on the left, those are kids who started quite young to drink, and their risk of alcohol addiction is quite high. And the longer a young person waits to begin their drinking, the lower their risk of addiction. And again, this is tied directly to the brain development issue we just talked about. Nicotine vaping is the other key thing to worry about when it comes to kids. It is inhaling and exhaling through a device, an aerosol that people sort of mistakenly refer to as vapor, which is produced by an e-cigarette or currently more high-tech looking devices that are very, very discreet, are loaded with nicotine and have loads of toxic ingredients in them, in many cases, including flavors that are made up of a lot of toxic chemicals. The most recent national data on vaping shows that more than 2.5 million middle and high school students report that they've used that they vaped in the past 30 days, the past month. More than 1 in 4 use it daily. The most common form of it that they use are these disposables, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the vast majority of kids who vape use flavored e-cigarettes. So you may have heard of Juul, which was a product that was very popular with kids for many years and still is, but there were a lot of regulations that came down upon it. So that kind of product sort of has reduced in popularity. And what has taken over now are these vaping products that are disposable, they get to skirt some of the regulations that the federal government put into place to control the vaping epidemic. And currently, these are very, very popular among young people, and they do come in all sorts of flavors with names like cheesecake and bubblegum and strawberry ice cream. A lot of them use something called synthetic nicotine, which is not well regulated by the government because it is not from the tobacco plant, and the government is in charge of controlling products that come from the tobacco plant. So these are synthetic nicotine, which can get through some of the loopholes, although the government is trying to crack down on that as well. The other type of nicotine product that is not a vape, but that is becoming increasingly popular, are these oral products, which are like gums and lozenges and gummies and tablets. These are not the same as nicotine replacement therapies, which can be prescribed for someone who wants to engage in smoking cessation. But these are extremely, extremely high in nicotine, and they also come in candy-like flavors, very discreet to use. It's really hard to know if your kid is chewing gum or a nicotine product. And they call themselves tobacco-free, so they sound very healthy and innocuous because they're made of synthetic nicotine and not from the tobacco plant. And like I said, super high in nicotine content. So what we know is that rates of vaping, which was really a crisis right before the pandemic hit, is still quite high. This is among middle and high school students, and is inching back up from its low during the pandemic. But if you look at these numbers and then you look at that square on the right, what you'll see is, for example, 14% of high school students, 3.5% of middle school students report vaping in the past 30 days in 2022. Overall, adults are just about 4.5% of vapers, and the companies claim that these products are meant for adults. So that's sort of questionable. And here what you're seeing is that of those kids who do vape, a lot of them are doing so frequently or even daily. Why do kids vape? They do it because their friends do it. They're curious. Some do it because they feel anxious, stressed, or depressed, and it gives them a little bit of a relief from that. Some like the feel of the nicotine. A lot do it because their family members do it. So there are all sorts of reasons. And again, like you saw with alcohol, the perception of how easily accessible these products are goes up as kids get older, and their perceptions of how risky they are tend to go down. A lot, when vaping first came out, people said, what's the big deal? It's not tobacco. It doesn't have tar and tobacco smoke. It's just nicotine. We've learned over the past few years through a flood of research just how harmful nicotine is to young people. It is extremely, extremely addictive. The addiction sets in very quickly. It is very hard to quit once you start using a nicotine product. It does have effects on the developing brain. It increases the child's risk of use and addiction to other substances as well. It affects their attention, their learning, their mood, impulse control. It, like alcohol, worsens mental health symptoms instead of improving them. And it has physiological effects as well. And we have to be concerned that a significant number of kids who vape will end up smoking cigarettes, because once you're addicted to nicotine, then you use all sorts of nicotine-related products. So a third of students who use one nicotine product use two or more. So it's called polyuse. It's not just restricted to vaping products. And then there's marijuana, which is becoming increasingly concerning because of the legalization movement throughout the United States. So again, you'll have these slides and you can look in more detail, but there are different ways that kids use marijuana and that adults do so: smoked, vaped, dabbing, and increasingly edibles, which is quite scary because a lot of young children are getting their hands on it and are experiencing the toxic effects of the main psychoactive ingredient in marijuana products, which is THC. And THC is quite concerning. As you can see here, the marijuana that people used in the 1990s had much lower rates of this psychoactive ingredient THC than is found in current products, marijuana products. And we know from a ton of research that the higher the concentration of THC in a product, the more severe the health effect, and the higher the potency, the higher the likelihood of developing mental health problems such as psychosis, anxiety disorder, and other problems. So this is really a significant issue, and it shouldn't be just sort of regarded as, oh, well, I smoked when I was a kid and nothing terrible happened. It's a completely different product today, what children are using compared to what people who use marijuana in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were using. Again, I just throw this in here so you could just see the same exact pattern that as kids get older, perceptions of accessibility increase and perceptions of risk decrease. And the reason these kind of graphs, charts are very important is for one of the lessons that I'll bring up later if I have time, which is it's never too early to start talking about these issues. The earlier you get in there with your kid and explain to them what the risks are and why you really care for their health and safety and for them not to use these products, the likelier you are to have an effect, because once they get to be later in high school, their beliefs and attitudes are going to be more entrenched than they are when they're younger. A whole range of effects of marijuana on young people, very similar to the other substances in that it affects their brain, it affects their academic performance, their orientation toward the future, their ability to kind of make plans and set goals and want to do things that are healthy and good for kids to want to do. It affects their mental health. There are fertility and reproductive issues. If someone is a chronic marijuana user, strong links to other substance use, and marijuana certainly is addictive. And here is that graph again. It looks almost like the alcohol one, but this is pertaining to marijuana, that the younger a person is when they start using, their risk of becoming addicted to the product is significantly higher. I'm just going to spend 1 or 2 minutes on prescription medications misuse. Fortunately, from the peaks of the opioid crisis, prescription opioid crisis, rates have gone down among teenagers and prescription medication use, but it's still something to be concerned about, especially as kids enter young adulthood. But among teenagers, the rates have been consistently going down. However, we all, I think, have heard of the fentanyl crisis, and I know Dr. Weiner is going to talk more about this, but despite the low and declining rates of prescription drug misuse overall among kids, kids who do put a pill in their mouth are at higher risk than they have ever been before, because fentanyl is this very, very potent opioid that is increasingly added to counterfeit pills that kids are accessing and using, and that they may not realize have fentanyl in them. And fentanyl could kill a young person pretty quickly, if not immediately. And what we have seen in the statistics is that between 2019 and 2020, the rate of overdose mortality among young people increased by 94%, and by another 20% the year after. And the majority of that was due to fentanyl that adolescents ingested, usually without realizing it. So before I hand it over to Dr. Weiner, who I think could give a lot of great tips on how to think about these issues from a broader clinical perspective and how to intervene, what I'd like to do is just take a couple of minutes. And again, I hope you do take a look at these slides on your own when you have more time and just think about them. We have put together these kind of, it sounds terrible to say like 10 key protective parenting strategies, like as if you just do these 10 things and everything's going to be perfect. I'm not trying to imply that at all, but these are sort of 10 strategies that we see in the research and in our work over and over again, that if they can be applied not only to preventing substance use among young people, but to encouraging resilience, building a child's strength and capacity and ability to think about the future and make plans and have confidence and try new things and stay safe and be healthy. And so it applies much more broadly. But essentially, like I said earlier, it's never too early to start addressing these issues and to be vigilant if you're seeing a sign of risk in your child at an early age or something that you think might put them at higher risk for engaging in substance use or having other issues. You don't want to be alarmist, but it's never too early to say, maybe I should pay attention to this now, and not assume that something is just going to pass and it's going to end up being okay. Like, it's better to intervene as early as you can. And to do that well, it's really important to know the facts about these issues that we're concerned about with our kids, not only so that we can understand what we should be worried about or how to intervene, but also so that our kids can see us as a really credible source of information. We really want them to come to us instead of to their friends or to the internet to find out information. And the more our information is accurate and evidence-based and not alarmist, the more they're going to come to us for that. Communicating openly and honestly with our kids is really critical for all these things that we want to have for our children. And sort of setting limits and sharing your expectations. So a lot of times parents say, well, my kids are going to use substances anyway. I'm not going to make a fool out of myself and tell them, I expect you not to use anything. No, you're not making a fool out of yourself. It's very important for parents to share their expectations that their children will behave, in a healthy, safe manner. Whether the child does that or not is separate from what your expectations are. And it's really important for them to understand that you are very solid and firm in your belief that these things are not healthy, these things are not good, and I expect you not to do it. Just like you expect your child to put a helmet on if they ride their bike, a seatbelt on if they get in their car, you expect them to protect their health and safety in those same ways when it comes to substance use. Monitoring their behavior. So that means supervising and kind of understanding what they're up to, both with media and social media and all those concerns, but also where are they? Who are they with? What are they doing? But it also means being able to monitor them enough so that you can recognize if something is changing, if they're having, a change in appearance and behavior and emotion and, their involvement in school and their friendships. So the more you're kind of observing and monitoring, the more you're going to be on top of it if something looks like it's going wrong. I said earlier that positive reinforcement rather than punishment really tends to work better. The next one is that adolescence is a time of risk-taking, so we don't want to suppress that. We just kind of want to encourage the healthier risk-taking behaviors instead of the more dangerous ones, and allow for them to express their emotions. That is part of normal development. It is not pathological for a kid to be angry or upset or anxious. That's fine, as long as it's within the bounds. Just as we would let our kids know that they are at risk for diabetes or some other illness because of a family history, we want to do the same when it comes to substance use. So if your child is at higher risk for substance use because of a family history of substance use or addiction, that's worth letting your child know so they can realize that if they take a drink or if they use a drug, their potential for addiction is significantly higher than their peers. And be prepared to respond accordingly if they are at higher risk and get the help that they need. Overarching is to always take a health approach and not a punitive approach. It works better. It makes more sense. Like, we're concerned for our kids' health and safety, and we want to convey that to them and operate under those parameters. And always remember that what you're doing is what your kids are watching. So that to the extent that you can model health and resilience and good coping skills and honesty and integrity, the better it's going to be for them. I am not going to go through these here, but I do hope you take a look at them later when you have a chance. So that's basically examples of each of those that I just said. I do want to say for a minute, sorry if this sounds like a plug, but we actually at our organization have tons of great resources to help you, with these kind of skills. We have a parent's guide to raising resilient kids. We have a free text messaging program that you can use to get tips and suggestions on how to help your kids develop in a healthy way. We have a risk assessment tool. These are all free and available on our website. We have a skill development course for parents that's self-guided and easy to use. And this is just a little more detail about that parent guide that I mentioned. So I want to make sure I leave enough time for Dr. Weiner, and I will just say thank you there, and that's my contact information.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richter.
Thank you.
As we said, she will be taking questions. So if you have any questions, please drop those in the chat, and we'll definitely get to them at the end. Our next speaker tonight is Dr. Aaron Weiner. He is a licensed board-certified psychologist and master addiction counselor. Dr. Weiner is a clinician, author, and frequent speaker on addiction treatment and issues. Dr. Weiner will share clinical insights into how parents can effectively address concerns about their children's mental health and substance use and get appropriate help when needed. Dr. Weiner.
All right, thank you so much. And somebody flag me down if I can't be heard, but I think I probably can. Thank you also, Dr. Richter, for that amazing overview of everything that's going on right now in substances. It was there is so much to think about, and actually your second slide really spoke to me in that way. I know I think very, very frequently about how things are really complicated for kids right now, in a lot of ways. And substances definitely are among those, even just looking at the increase in potency that we've been seeing. But what I'd like to do for my section with you folks, and we'll talk for about a half an hour, I think, or so, maybe 35 minutes before turning it over to the Q&A, is scope out for a second and talk a little bit about what's going on in the mental health and coping side of things, and then really drill back down and talk about what you as parents can do to both notice if there's a problem and then start to work on it, to build on what Dr. Richter was talking about. So I will do my best not to repeat, but instead supplement what you've already heard. And so we've talked a little bit already about how right now it's a very challenging time for in terms of substance use and mental health. And so I just want to highlight that in a couple of ways. The first is this recent data from the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey that looks at, they take this every couple of years. And what they found was that in the most recent data from 2021, there were a tremendous amount of young people, this is trending in the wrong direction, who are experiencing depressive symptoms, but then 1 out of 5 seriously considered attempting suicide and made a plan. And then 1 out of 10 teenagers right now attempted suicide in 2021, which is just absolutely unacceptable, not in terms of, that their behavior is unacceptable, but that we are failing our children in this way, where if 1 out of 10 of them have gotten that far, and we have to step up. We have to step up as a community, as a society. I'm not singling anybody out, of course, but this number has to come down. And hopefully tonight we can talk a little bit about how we can do that. Additionally, if we look at this from the anxiety standpoint, we're seeing the same trend where over the course of the pandemic, we've seen anxiety rates double amongst kids, up to about 1 in 5. And the trend is actually that it's been worsening over time when you look at where it started to where it's gotten to right now. So I first though want to start, we're not going to talk as much about information, or let's talk a little bit more about what you can see and do. And I want to start by just with the very basics of how do you know if there's a problem? Because teenage kids could be challenging at the best of times, right? Like it's hard to, they can be oppositional. They can be trying to define, that push off the wall of the pool, that sort of thing. And so the first recommendation that I would have for you, and perhaps one of the most important today, is to really be as connected as possible with your kids. And I know that sounds basic, but if you don't know what normal looks like, you're not going to know when anything changes. And so when I say normal, I mean in terms of how your son or daughter deals with stress, where their mood is generally, who they like to hang out with, how they're feeling, all the things that are going on in their life. You have to have a baseline. And so that in terms of problematic reactions, and we're going to talk about a few things to watch for in just a second, but it's really important that you know what normal is, because normal is different for every child. There's no one way to define that. So when talking about general signs of emotional distress, I like to break it down into 2 categories: internalizing symptoms and externalizing symptoms. And again, we'll drill down a little bit deeper as well. But as a general rule here, you can think of internalizing as someone's feeling the stress and pressure inside, and so they kind of collapse in on themselves. So you might be seeing academic problems with sleeping, difficulty concentrating, shutting down per se, withdrawing socially from folks they normally like to hang out with, some body or somatic problems like frequent headaches or stomach aches, and not wanting to go to school because they feel sick, that sort of thing. Or if they're escaping essentially into social media or games and avoiding what they're feeling that way. And certainly if they're harming themselves, self-harming behaviors like cutting or anything else to intentionally cause damage to the body usually comes from a really strong feeling that a young person doesn't know how to cope with, either a feeling of numbness or feeling overwhelmed. There's a lot of reasons for it, but ultimately it serves a purpose, which is a point that we'll come back to in a second as well. It's just not the healthiest way of achieving that goal. On the externalizing front, we're looking at symptoms that you could very much see that are projected out. So moodiness and defiance, alcohol and drug use, extreme sensitivity to criticism, because as I'm sure you can relate to, if you have somebody who confirms your worst fears, you tend to react pretty, like if you've got this inner monologue that's incredibly critical in certain ways, and then you hear someone say that again from the outside, it is devastating. And so if a young person seems to be reacting really strongly to constructive feedback that perhaps doesn't seem to elicit that sort of response, that might be what's going on. If they're engaging in reckless or self-destructive behavior, or certainly violence and quote unquote your classic acting out. So specifically, some things to watch for. On the depression front, you're looking for negative thinking, expectancies for the future, comments. If they're making statements of low self-esteem, so like how they're not worth very much and they're not going to make it amount to anything, that sort of thing. If they're not enjoying things they normally do, our technical name for that is anhedonia, but basically if they're basically just not doing anything, and when you offer things they normally like, they're saying no. That's a very common sign of depression. They're crying all the time, and certainly if they're displaying any suicidal indicators, which unfortunately we have to talk about, because again, 1 out of 10 teenagers has attempted suicide in the past year. So things to watch for here in particular are if they ever make statements or say that they're thinking about death or suicide. Again, it's not uncommon for anybody to think about death, but not that frequently. Like that, it shouldn't come up that much, and it certainly shouldn't be positive in any way. Like how much better things would be for everybody if I was gone, or it would be easier if I wasn't here. Those sorts of statements are very big red flags. If you see a young person giving away valued items as if they're not going to need them, or almost counterintuitively, if you see a really abrupt positive shift in someone's mood, if they've been very depressed and then all of a sudden it seems like they're not, that may seem like a good thing on its face, but actually getting over depression oftentimes takes a lot of work and time and therapy or medication. And so if you see a really abrupt shift, it might be because someone has decided they're going to kill themselves, and so they feel like relief is right around the corner. And so that's actually something to watch for and be very cautious about if it seems like folks just snap out of it very quickly. On the anxiety front, which is again, one of these 2 most common problems we're seeing in young people right now, and adults too for that matter, but you're looking for a general sense of overwhelm, franticness, moving quickly, avoidance of certain activities or groups, panic attacks, those sorts of things. Now, in terms of youth substance use, this is a persistent problem. Dr. Richter went over this already in her slides, so I am not going to spend very long on this, but really what I want to point out is that I'd really just underscore teenage years are the most important time to not be using substances. And unfortunately, that is when most people start using substances for most of these things. If you can get folks into their 20s without starting to use these things, there's a much greater chance that they're not going to develop a problem. Granted, there are a lot of kids who use something, and we've got to work with them as well, but that's part of why in the prevention world, we talk a lot about not doing it, if at all possible, because when we look at the statistics, that gives folks the best chance. Now, unfortunately, there are a couple of areas where we're seeing growth as opposed to decreases or holding steady. E-cigarette use, vaping is one of them. There's so much that we could say on these specific topics. We're not going to dive too deep, any more deep into it today. But essentially, we've seen this 21% increase year over year in some of this recent data. And then the other 2 that I want to highlight right now have to do with marijuana or THC, and then also hallucinogens. All 3 of these, nicotine vaping, THC, and hallucinogens, it's not a coincidence that they all have these very strong venture capital, industry backed, there's a lot of money coming into these areas right now, pushing out a lot of messaging that appeals directly to young people, because that's oftentimes the way either addiction for profit or intoxicating markets work. But we're going to pivot back now to this idea of coping, because that's really the heart of what I'd like to talk with you guys about for the time that we have together. And the question that I want to use to springboard here is, why do we choose to cope poorly? Like if you're looking at your kids and you're saying, well, so like, why are they doing that? This doesn't make much sense. Well, if we had a better option, maybe we would do it. But actually, to part of our brain, substances seem like a really good idea. And so I like to diagram the brain under stress or distress with this very anatomically correct diagram of a dog driving a car. And the reason why I really like this as a stand-in for the human brain under stress is that you can kind of think about our brain as having two main processes here. We have a very advanced thinking side. That is the car, that is the Tesla in this picture. That is our prefrontal cortex. That's where we house our executive functioning, our ability to moralize and plan ahead and synthesize big ideas. We can do bunches of stuff that other animals can't. However, it is not as strong. It is weaker than our primal, more animalistic limbic system, the dog. Cute one here, by the way, in my opinion. But the limbic system, when we get stressed, the limbic system takes control, and it has two prime directives. The number one thing our limbic system wants, just like any animal, is to not be in pain. We do not like discomfort. The second thing that it wants is to create as much pleasure as possible. And so what happens then when you get, say for example, you're in a fight with someone you care about in a verbal altercation, and they're raising their voice or they're saying hurtful things. Well, the chances in that moment that you're much more likely to, you are much more likely to say respond in anger and yell and lash out, even though you love this person, even though you might not entirely mean what you're saying, even though it doesn't really accomplish your goals because you don't want to hurt the person you love. What's going on there is there's a part in your brain that's saying, I'm in pain, I'm hurting, I have all this pressure inside. You know what would feel really good? Discharging it and shutting this down. So the dog takes the wheel, and that's why I like this metaphor, is that it's like you can imagine when you're stressed out that the dog takes the wheel of the car and says, you know what's going to work right now to fix it? Getting high, getting drunk. That's going to solve this problem. That's going to solve feeling socially excluded. That's going to solve depression. That's going to solve anxiety. That's going to solve whatever it is right now. Because just like dogs don't think about the future, right? They're not thinking about, well, how's this going to impact my relationship with my parents, or what's the legal ramifications of this, or if I do this enough, am I going to get addicted? Dogs don't think about any of that, right? It's here and now. We've got that part in our brain too. And actually, kids don't even have a fully developed prefrontal cortex yet. That's not done cooking until you're about 25 years old, in truth. So they've got this overactive limbic system. They've got this underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. Their dog can very easily take the wheel of the car. So it's less that they are choosing to cope poorly, and more that there's a very logical reason why they're doing what they're doing in their mind. But it can be short-sighted kind of just because of the way we're all built, essentially. So another way then to think about bad behavior is that behaviors are the tip of the iceberg. And we're not going to go deep into this model, but this is Stuart Shanker's self-reg model. And I highly recommend looking this up if you're interested. But basically, when you see a child acting out, they're trying to complete their stress cycle. They're trying to discharge energy. They're trying to regulate themselves on any one of these 5 areas: biological, emotional, cognitive, social, or pro-social, or what society expects of them. And so a lot of times parents get really caught up in the what. Like, what are they doing? Are they vaping? Are they smoking? Are they doing something I don't want them to do? But they miss the why, which is actually perhaps the most important part of affecting a young person's behavior in the long term, is understanding why. Because getting back to what Dr. Richter was saying, you can't punish a basic need out of a kid, right? Like they still have that need. All you're doing is taking away their go-to strategy, which to the dog driving their car was a really good, effective tool. So they're probably going to be angry at you about that, right? So there's a lot of, I mean, it's a pretty complicated web, but you got to get to the root of the problem, because behavior is always purpose-driven, even if it doesn't seem to make sense on the surface. If you don't know why your child is doing what they're doing, that doesn't mean, that they're just, an alien, or whatever that example was from Dr. Richter's slides as well. There is a reason. We just need to understand it. And that really is what all unhealthy coping is about. And that's honestly how I frame a lot of substance use. It's trying to solve a problem, but not necessarily in the most effective way. So if you think about mood as being on like a continuum from where you could be really happy, maybe even overly so, to really negative, and on that negative side is where you've got like fury or clinical depression, panic attacks, or chronic anxiety. When you are in this state, that's when you start to get these really unhealthy coping behaviors like nervous tics or phobias, addictive behaviors, snapping at people, all these sorts of things. All of this is a way of trying to regulate yourself. And so if you see a young person doing it, that's ideally what I'd encourage you to think about, is that this is behavior is here for a reason. Your child is trying to either regulate themselves or express something, and you've got to decode it. Yes, the behavior matters. Yes, it might be harmful in some way, and you've got to pay attention to that too. But even more important is getting down to the why, because so often, particularly with high schoolers, if you're just trying to basically brute force your child into behaving in a certain way, your best scenario is as soon as they leave the house and go off to college, they're right back to where they started. And they probably don't have a good coping skill, or set of them anyway, for dealing with whatever it was they were already struggling with. So let's pivot into this question then of how can we help? If that's the paradigm, if the paradigm is kids are under a tremendous amount of stress, they're trying to regulate themselves, they might not know how, they might see some shortcuts that seem super appealing, even though they're actually not effective. How can we help? I want to run through some ideas with you guys now that hopefully you can perhaps put into practice pretty quickly. So first things first is stay connected to your kid, as I mentioned, and know the signs of use. And just for sake of time, I'm going to put this whole slide up at once. It's going to be pretty big, but basically what you want to look for here is a whole bunch of things in a few different areas. The first is you're going to start to see problems for many kids at school, because if you're getting drunk or high all the time, it's hard to concentrate, it's hard to study. That time has to come from somewhere. You might start seeing changes in their peer group. Unless all of their peers have moved towards substance use, they might have some new friends, but they really don't want you to meet them, because then you're going to know more about what's going on. Also, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, please be on your kids' phones and devices. You're paying for them. It is not a safe place for them to be wandering around alone. The entire world has access to them there in many cases. So make sure that you're on their social media. You're probably going to notice some strain dynamics at home, as they know probably that they're doing something that you're not a fan of. They're hiding things from you. You're going to see them be more moody. The relationship is going to get strained, etc. And then a whole bunch of changes potentially in personal appearance and habits, from everything from their hygiene to dilated or red eyes can be a sign of THC concentrate use. A whole bunch of things there that I encourage you to look at. No one of these things means that you've got someone with a substance use disorder, someone who's getting high or who's drinking, but you start to put a lot of this together, right? This idea that someone's getting impaired, they're not necessarily themselves, they're spending money, they might be more disorganized. It's hard to hold everything together. That being said, some really smart kids can, particularly through high school and sometimes even through college, like they can hold the grades together. So that alone isn't really enough. Usually at a certain point, if you've got an addiction going on, they hit a wall. And ideally, you really want to try to help them before they hit that wall, because there are very few people who are truly smart enough to deal with escalating addiction and then continue to succeed at school, certainly, but much less at work and even like in family life. It's, going to take a bulldozer to a lot of it eventually. So you got to know the signs of use. You got to stay connected. The most important thing beyond that is you have to be safe to talk to. And I want to share a model for how to create and demonstrate emotional safety. And I did not make up this acronym, but it's called Communicate with Love. This is coined by the Center for Motivation and Change. But love stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. And the reason why we're talking about this in conjunction with emotional safety is that if you are not emotionally safe to talk to, your child is not going to talk to you about the stuff that really matters, particularly the stuff they think you're not going to like. So you've got to let them know, even if there are going to be some consequences, even if it's not something that you're going to necessarily approve of, they've got to feel like they can talk to you about it, or you're not going to hear about it. And the thing about safety is that it is an emotion, so you can't tell someone it. This actually gets back to that dog and car metaphor. The limbic system is where you feel things. The prefrontal cortex, the thinking side, is how you think. So you can't tell someone, I'm a safe person, you can trust me. It doesn't work, right? Not even a little bit. You need to show them that you're safe. They need to experience safety from you over and over and over again. That's how emotions and trust and safety works. You show someone consistently over time. And this is how you do it, by listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. So briefly for each of these, listening refers to open-ended questions and reflections. Active listening is what this is all about. So you are showing someone that you're listening. You are not assuming that that's the case by asking them questions that require elaborative answers. Like, instead of saying, "Did you have a good day at school?" "Yeah." You can instead say, "What was the most interesting part of your day today?" Or you could say, is there something that you're like, what's the most challenging part at school right now that you're dealing with? Even if they don't answer you, even if they're being evasive or don't want to talk, it shows that you care. And that matters. Reflection means you take information that someone's telling you and then you give it back to them in different words, either the emotions back or the content back. It shows them that you're listening, if you can return the idea or the feeling back in different words. All this stuff on the slide, by the way, is #therapist tricks. Like, this is the stuff that we as psychologists do all the time, day in and day out. But it works. It works for everybody. It works for everybody. The O is for offering, or more specifically, how do you offer feedback or advice? And this is so important because a lot of times when parents are pushy, that lets their kids push back. So if you don't push, kids can't push back. How you do that is, instead of just offering guidance and advice, you offer it in what's called a feedback sandwich, where you sandwich the advice in 2 slices, metaphorically, of autonomy. So what that means is, the first slice of autonomy is you ask your child if they want to hear what you have to say. Now, sometimes they can't have that option. I understand that. But if they can, you can say, like, "I've been in a similar situation. Do you mind if I share something that worked for me?" Or like, "I've got a thought about this. Can I share it?" If you ask someone if they want to hear your advice, then they are consenting to the information. They have literally asked for you to tell them how you feel. That is the opposite of pushing. They've literally asked for it. So you ask permission, then you offer the information, and then you follow up by asking how they feel about it. You can even explicitly give someone a chance to disagree. You can say, "Hey, like, I know I just got up on a soapbox for a second. How do you feel about that? It's really okay if you don't agree with me." And then listen and, actively listen to what they have to say. What happens then is that they have asked for the advice, they've heard it, and then they've had a chance to agree with it. And what we know from research is there's a much greater chance that they are going to take that advice and do it when they're not right in front of you, than if you just put out there what they're supposed to do, right? They might be like, yeah, or push back or whatever it is. This makes them feel like they have sought out the information. They have decided that they're going to use it. It goes a long, long way towards people actually doing it. The V in love stands for validating. So essentially, let someone know that what they're feeling is okay, even if the strategy that they're using to deal with their feeling is not the best, even if they made a mistake. You want to validate emotions. It's so important that kids can trust their gut, right? That they feel like what they're dealing with is normal, that they are okay as people. That's a huge part about emotional safety, is validating somebody. So just make sure, really try to see your child and validate how they feel. Empathize with them as well. There's a lot of overlap in that Venn diagram before you try to change anything. And to borrow a phrase here from Brene Brown, when you empathize with someone, you want to get into their dark hole. People generally don't want to be like, "I have a problem," and then just have someone ride in, like a white knight on a horse, and scoop them up and carry them off to safety. That actually kind of feels disempowering in a way. I mean, like, it can be helpful sometimes, but what people generally like more is for you to sit down next to them and hear them and be with them and empathize and validate. And then perhaps ask, "Hey, I want to get out of here. I've got an idea about what could help," right? And then you show them where to go, right, when they ask for it. So try this out: listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. If you don't already have an emotionally safe relationship with your child, where they open up to you and they really see you as an ally, though, have persistence and don't get discouraged. So again, our emotional world, if we have an emotional deficit, like emotional safety or whatever it is, depression, anxiety, we learn through experience, like I said before, right? Because the limbic system responds to experiences, not to logic. So we learn through experiences over and over again. Just like, say, if you were training a dog, right? You've got to, they don't learn sit, right? They don't hear the word really. What they hear are these phonemes, and then they get a treat when they put their butt down. And when you give them treats over and over and over again, day after day, they learn, oh, sit means sit, right? That's how they learn. Our emotions work the same way. So if you don't have that relationship with your child right now, it's not going to spring up overnight. Have persistence. Don't get discouraged. It just takes some time. So let's keep going here. So discussion strategies, and we're going to go quick. I think I've only got maybe like 5-7 minutes left before we should probably pivot to the Q&A. So we'll get through as much as we can. But what you want to make sure you do, and I think Dr. Richter touched on some of this. So you want to communicate your attitudes and expectations clearly. It really does matter. Really does. The data says this. So make sure you talk about it. Also, though, don't shy away from the positives of substance use. Tell the whole story. You got to actually say, particularly to older kids, like why it might seem tempting, because they're going to hear about it from other people potentially, right? And you don't want to seem like you're just trying to pull the wool over their eyes, or there's something you're not telling them. Like, let's be honest, right? Like, it's actually really scary what it does to to young people's minds. If you look at the science, it's like really not good. And so if you've instilled those values, like your body matters to your kids, and you say, listen, so like this is why some kids might think it's a good idea. Here's why it's really not. That actually, and then empower them to make the choice. That actually tends to work a lot better than only telling them part of the story and then them realizing, oh wait, like why were my parents leaving this stuff out? And we know also scare tactics aren't always effective. It's important to be honest. Like I say all the time right now, whenever I speak, this is a terrible time to be using street drugs, to be using any drugs at all with all the fentanyl contamination. And I know Dr. Richter alluded to this as well, but I think that the phrase right now that's being used by the American Academy of Pediatrics is one pill can kill. It's really bad out there, really bad. I don't have the slide on it, but kids, adolescents right now are the fastest growing overdose group because of fentanyl contamination, and because 90% of overdoses right now, opioids anyway, are coming from fentanyl. So they need to know about that. That's legit. That's a real present world danger right now, and lots of drugs. And that aside, we don't just want to come across like we're trying to scare people. Like kids, they really see through that. They push off against that. You want to start early to create an accurate narrative, and I cannot impress this enough. If you are attending this talk or watching the recording and your children are still at the point where they haven't encountered this in the wild, talk to them about it now, because they're probably not going to get accurate information when their friends are telling why it's so great that they're vaping or why marijuana isn't such a big deal. They're not going to get an accurate story. And then you're fighting against a narrative that's not true. So if you can give folks accurate information from jump, if you can give your kids that real world true information, because again, the facts are, in my opinion, scary enough as is. If you've got a kid who values their future, you want to talk about it early. You want them to be prepared. Share that information so they know fact from fiction. And then it can be helpful sometimes as well to, instead of asking, like, if you've got an older child, like, are you doing this? Ask about their friends. Like, do you have any friends who are doing this? Like, I read this thing about vaping, or I read, is this going on in your world? Or you see this at all at school? And just put that out there. It's so much easier for kids to talk about other people than about themselves. And that can be a chance for you to circle back, even in the same conversation, or this is a long game. The conversation doesn't have to be over, and shouldn't, in fact, the first time you talk about it. When it comes to substances, you want to keep talking about it over time, checking in about it, not like nagging necessarily, because, right, that can be obnoxious to them, but, come back to it. I'd say at least once a year, because as they get older, they're going to see more and more and more of this. It's just the reality of the world that we live in. And you want to be there. You want to be there for them to talk to as that emotionally safe person when it's time. So you really want to emphasize healthy connections in terms of coping. So again, we're going to go quickly through this to be mindful of time, but I like to think about connectivity as there's a social side to it, a behavioral and emotional side to connectivity, that all of them are useful. Socially, kind of self-explanatory, but human connection is so important to have, both within a family, also with others. I have this picture of a family playing video games, not to say that you should play video games, although you can, but more to say, go to where your kids are. Don't make them just like do the stuff you like. If they like stuff, go there too. right? Show them that they matter to you as people and that you're taking an interest in them. The behavioral has more to do with like intra-connectivity, so someone knowing themselves. So our brain is always looking at our bodies about how to feel. If we are acting depressed, we feel more depressed. If we're being avoidant, we feel more anxious about something. So it's really important that we know how our behavior affects our emotional world. And then in our emotional world, it's really important to be able to identify and express the emotions you're feeling, or that's what leads to coming out in ways that are much less helpful. So some destructive things to talk about, and I'll put these all up here right now. I guess I'll start here at the bottom. Just FYI, what you permit, you promote. So if there's something going on right now that is not helpful or that's causing problems in your house, or you see your child, if you're ignoring it because you're afraid of your kid or they throw a fight or you think it's just easier if you don't mess with it, that means it's going to grow and it's going to get worse. That form of anxious avoidance, for example, is a form of enabling. And what enabling is when you essentially allow a behavior to continue because you're bailing somebody out. Like that behavior would collapse in on itself if it existed in a vacuum. Like say, staying up all night playing video games and waking up and not getting up, in time for school. And you're getting your child up and you're getting them breakfast, on the way out the door, and you're kind of propping them up. If your child doesn't experience consequences, one, they're probably not going to change. But two, if that's something you're facilitating, then it's really important to see your part in the cycle. A lot of times when this happens, parents don't even know they're doing it. It is not their fault. It feels like loving, right? Like protect your kid from pain. It feels like the right thing to do. Unfortunately, not always when it comes to maladaptive coping. Sometimes they actually have to feel uncomfortable to have enough motivation to change. So it's really important to keep that in mind too. All right, a little bit more. Again, we're going to have to go quickly, guys. Sorry, we overpacked this today. But you really want to promote them to develop healthy coping. So just really quickly, pay attention to the physical body, sleep, exercise, nutrition. Meditation and breath work are so useful and important. They're transdiagnostic. They work for a bunch of stuff. Model, like Dr. Richter said, about how to talk through emotions and problems. And also, don't be afraid to take a child to therapy. I think a lot of parents feel like it's a referendum on them or something. Like if you'd done a better job, they wouldn't have to go. That's actually not how it works. There's so much that's outside of your control that your children go through. And if you've learned anything from Dr. Richter or I, that's because this is our job. We're professionals. We don't bite. We have a lot to offer. So, there's a lot of really good therapists out there, many who specialize in working with kids. It's totally worth getting help if you're seeing your child move in a negative direction. So if your child is acting out, you do need consistent boundaries and limits around that behavior, like a cause and effect. But like Dr. Richter said, what is most closely related to behavioral change is positive reinforcement. If you see a behavior you like, you want to reward that. That is, by the way, why if you've got a child who's using substances, that's why they keep doing it, because they're getting that short-term immediate reward. When behaviors are rewarded, we repeat them. And so you have to use that to your advantage as well. Make sure to have access to phones and mobile devices. Very briefly, most drug deals going on right now at school are either going on at school or on Instagram, Discord, or Snapchat. That is where this is happening. This is very well known. The DEA actually recently put out a nice little code sheet, which you now have on these slides. Yeah, there's the One Pill Can Kill campaign. But if you see these emojis, these oftentimes have something to do with drugs. So just something to watch for, something to think about. A lot of that goes on right now on social media. Be on the same page as your parenting partner. It's so important to be consistent, and then take care of yourself and your marriage if you are in one. Your kids, as Dr. Richter mentioned, are always watching you. They're soaking everything up like a sponge. So again, lightning round here. If you need help, where to find therapists. I love these 3 sites in particular, the 2 here on the left. Psychology Today sometimes can be just a huge dump of everybody. Hard to find the person you're looking for. I really like these 2. I should mention, by the way, I'm not being paid by any of these folks. This is just my personal thoughts and feelings about it. If there is an emergency, if someone's in immediate crisis, that's what 911 is for. You may also have heard of 988. This is a fantastic service that was just created, I think, like about 6 months ago, 24/7 crisis line. However, if there's actually like an emergent crisis, they're just going to redirect you to 911 anyway. So if there's a mental health, like an acute mental health need, but not like someone's actively suicidal or a danger to themselves or others, that's what 988 is for. But when in doubt, you can always call 988 and they'll just hook you up with 911 if that's where you really need to be. So, summing everything up, teens right now, they're facing numerous pressures that lead them towards unhealthy coping behaviors. As parents, though, what you can do is stay connected so you know when something changes, watch for signs of a problem, and we talked about what those were. Understand the why, not just the what. All behavior has a purpose, and you need to understand what that is. Talk early and talk often to your kids. Establish and maintain that emotional safety, encourage healthy coping, provide opportunities for healthy connections, and know where to go for help. So, thank you for dealing with my car salesman-esque presentation here. I know we were trying to pack so much in, but I will stop my screen share now, and we'll be happy to be part of the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Weiner, and thank you, Dr. Richter, as
Pleasure.
well. And thank you to all of you who are joining us. I know it's getting late on the East Coast, but for this important webinar, which has been really informative, even for me as a parent of only a 5-year-old. I learned a lot, and I'm sure many of you have also learned a lot. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you to both Doctors Weiner and Richter. One question that came in, which I'm sure many have, is if a kid has trouble sleeping, is melatonin bad to give to the kid? Either of you, Dr. Richter or Weiner?
It's not my area. I'm going to give that to you, Dr. Weiner.
Yeah, so I think, but as nice ethical psychologists, we're going to say that's outside of our scope of practice, and it actually is. I'm not sure what exactly the data on melatonin. What I will say, though, is most of the time, with most folks, you're not dealing with a biological insomnia. You're dealing with a psychological insomnia. And so if your child is having trouble sleeping, I wouldn't go straight to the meds. I'd start to look at what's the reason why they're struggling. Are they practicing good sleep hygiene? And we could talk for half an hour about that. Or Google that, they'll find some good tips. Are they having racing anxious thoughts at night? Is there some phobia that they have to the dark? I wouldn't necessarily go to the melatonin. I'd start to really, again, drill down into the why. It's probably not that their circadian rhythm is off, would be my hunch.
Definitely if you're somewhere where it's lit out, right? Thank you. Another question that came in was about teenage boys and online gambling. Is that something either of you can address?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about it a little bit. So I don't know those statistics. I do know that it's increased. What I can say is that online gambling is either like sports betting or loot boxes and microtransactions and games is getting growing and growing and growing. I mean, addiction is in many ways seen as a good thing in terms of games and TV shows, and it's kind of being baked into our vernacular. I have actually personally treated multiple teenagers who have had gambling problems online. This is, I would say, though, a phone problem more than anything else. That this is something where if they don't have the access to it, it's going to be very hard for them to do it. They're probably not encountering big time bookies at school, right? This is something that's happening on the computer. So it is a problem. It's something where there are treatments for it. It definitely can get out of hand even at a young age, but every time I've seen it, it comes from kids got a phone, kids on the computer, they're doing stuff on there, and they know how to get around their parents. And if that was taken away, it would, again, that doesn't solve necessarily the underlying issue, and you still got to get at that. But at least the gambling behavior, where are they getting the money from? Are they getting into debt? You can do something about that.
Okay. And question that just came in for parents of younger children. What's the best way to start this conversation? Specifically on 5 toddlers, I think a lot of these toddlers might be seeing it.
Yeah, if I could just weigh in here, I think there are tons of ways to have age appropriate conversations about these things. And again, the modeling issue is really important. So even a young child, when they see a parent who, feels a little anxious or stressed or has a little headache and they're rushing to the pills, to the medicine, that's sending a message to children that if you're feeling any discomfort, you got to put something in your body to get rid of it, as opposed to watching a parent who says, I have a bad headache, I'm going to go take a bath, or I'm going to go out for a walk. Those are showing healthier ways of coping with discomfort or bad feelings that gets conveyed to a child. And then with specific substances, I think, it's not too early. If, you pass someone on the street who's smoking a cigarette, or you see an ad for alcohol or something, kids, you're not going to introduce a concept to a 5-year-old to start drinking or smoking if you mention, oh, these are things some people do and it's so unhealthy. And, it's so important to do things that are healthy for your body and for your brain. And that's the most important thing, so it's always in the framework of health and safety, and that's true for any age. And you certainly don't want to tell a 5-year-old about, the harms of heroin and cocaine. That's not necessary, but you can start on the sort of more simple level, and they get it.
I would say so with my 5-year-old. We have Dr. Pollock, who said, if a teenager is already addicted, where is the best place to go to get help? I know you mentioned a few, Dr. Weiner.
Yeah, well, I mean, Dr. Richter might have some thoughts about this as well. So I would say the first question, where should you go for help? So I think the first question is what are they addicted to? How severe is it? So you might want to get an assessment done, either take them to a therapist or even a treatment center that can help determine like what needs to happen here. There are some kids who are using like for social acceptance, but they're not like straight addicted to like say something that you would go to treatment for. Nicotine is kind of a weird one in that you can't get the same kinds of treatments. It's a little bit different. But if we're talking about like alcohol or THC, which are going to be the two most common, or prescription pills, I think a lot of it is, do they need to be seeing a therapist? Do they need to be going to what's called an intensive outpatient program, or a partial hospitalization program, or a residential treatment center? There's a lot of different tiers, and really who you want to get connected with is someone who knows that terrain, who can give a really good professional recommendation about it. And so that would be my first thought. If you don't know who that is, it's also a great idea to go to the pediatrician, because they probably do. They work with this all the time. I'm a big fan of pediatricians for this. So that would be, if you really don't know where to turn, that's another option, as well as if there's a school counselor, that's something where they probably have folks they work with on this all the time. So just trusted either medical or behavioral health folks would be my recommendation in your community.
And we got a few questions, which I know both of you sort of addressed, is that, a lot of teenagers are definitely surrounded by others who are either vaping or smoking or drinking. How do you broach that subject with your teenager? Not just broach it, but what do you tell your teenager? And how do you handle a situation if, let's say, your teenager tells you about specific friends or relatives which are engaging in such behavior?
You want to go first on
Dr.
this one,
Weiner.
Dr. Richter?
No, you go ahead. Okay.
All right. So that's really tough, right? And I would say that probably the most challenging situation for parents is when there's like this triangle between friends and parents and your kids, because it seems it's like in so many cases like they care more about that relationship with their friends potentially than with you, or maybe they are worried. I mean, and that actually, from their health and safety standpoint is helpful if they're looking at that behavior and being like, wow, that really concerns me. But ultimately, critical thought is helpful and important. But what you might find is that there are different communities of folks at school as well. And if a child is part of a peer group where it just starts to kind of devolve into being very substance centric, that may also be something where then they don't feel like they fit there anymore, or they feel like they have to do it in order to fit in. And it's really helping them parse through like, what's the right path and decision for you? Are these people who you want to be spending as much time with? The fact of the matter is, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your situation, we pick up a lot from the peers we surround ourselves with as adults, as kids. A lot of who we surround ourselves with rubs off on us and our behavior, on norms. And so the more healthy environments, for example, that you could put your child into, where they can see, oh, like there are kids who have fun without vaping, without drinking all the time. There are kids who are doing this, because actually the vast majority are. That's not what everybody is doing, at least when you look at population data. Dr. Richter spoke to that in hers as well. So if you've got a child who's in a kind of like a subculture or a subset that's very substance centric, that can be very challenging, but it's also not all there is. So I don't know, Dr. Richter, do you have another thought about that?
I think the second part of that question, which is, I think, or maybe I saw it in the chat, do you tell the other parent if your child's friend is using something? It's so complicated. And, my inclination is no, unless it's pretty significantly harmful, because for teenagers, especially, their friendships and violating those codes is like so sacred. And so there's ways, I think, at least as a first step, is to try and help your child help their friend. and see if you can help your child talk to the friend, get them to maybe open up to their own parents, or if not to their own parents, then to a school counselor or somewhere where they can get the help that they need. But it sounds so selfish to like kind of protect your own relationship with your child at the expense of someone else's, but it's a very hard thing to navigate. And so as a first step, I wouldn't rush to go tell the other parent. I would try and help my child, help their friend get help, because you don't always know what the kid's parent child relationship is like. Like the parent could be very punitive. It's kind of hard to know what the consequences would be. So certainly it's something down the line that you might end up doing, but it might not be the first step. Super complicated though.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, thank you, Dr. Weiner and Dr. Richter, for all of the information and the Q&A as well. A link will be sent to everybody with a survey shortly. The survey helps us plan these events and future events, so please do take a couple of minutes to share your feedback and suggestions. As well, the recording of tonight's event will be along with and I believe that link to the survey was sent out, also has links to both Dr. Weiner's and Dr. Richter's presentations. A recording of the entire presentation will be emailed to you all in the next 2 days. If you enjoyed this event, I do encourage you to visit our website, wellnessinstitute.org, to join our upcoming events. Our next event is on May 17th in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month, which is coming up in May. It's titled Voices of Resilience, Finding Hope and Strength in the Face of Mental Health Challenges. It's free of charge, and you can sign up at wellnessinstitute.org/voices of resilience. If you're a clinician, we have a training for clinicians titled Introduction to Attachment-Based Family Therapy with the developer of ABPP, Dr. Guy Diamond, which you can also sign up at wellnessinstitute.org/ABPP. And I want to again thank everybody for joining us and wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you again.